afternoon. We are in the second debate of this index Biennale. And perhaps some of you already saw yesterday one of the persons that is here today with us. The conversation will be about this. Well, the main topic is this title, conflict soundscapes. But I think we will go to a lot of different soundscapes and a lot of different topics. I will just do a very brief presentation of Lendl Barcelos and Lawrence Abu Hamdan that we thought when we were seeing their works that there is kind of a key to connect the work of both of you, that it's this relationship with sound and embodiment, and then it expresses in different ways that we'll speak about it now. So perhaps I'll start with Lawrence. Lawrence, as perhaps most of you know, has 3 pieces here in Index Biennale. One was Air Pressure, that was presented yesterday in Teatro Circo. It's a performance for those who didn't saw it. We can speak a little bit after, but it's a performance where it's an investigation also on the effects of this, the sound of military airplanes that came from the Israeli army and invade the aerial space in Lebanon. And you can also see 2 other pieces, rubber coated steel, that it's a video that it's in the main room upstairs in Teatro Circo, and 45 parallel. We'll speak perhaps a little bit also about this. So Lawrence, it's working in this with sound, but not only. So he's in the biography. You can see that he identifies himself like we can say a kind of detective, privateer, and his work expresses itself in performance, books, lectures, forensic reports, and looking to unveil corporate state and environmental violence. He won the Turner Prize in 2019. He's been presenting his works internationally. And Lendl Barcelos, it's a DJ. He teaches, he writes essays also. He's an audio technician, and thinking about this key that puts them together. I was especially interested also in this project that it developed. That the name is Infinite Ear Project. It's on deafness and sonic experience. Perhaps we'll speak also after about this. He also presented in several places, Venice Biennale, Tremor, Tate Britain, different places. And what we will start by doing, I'll give the word also to Lendl, because for this Biennale, you don't have any work presented, so I think I will invite you to put something on the table about your work and your questions now on your work. So, and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Okay, great. Hello. Thanks a lot, everyone, and also for the invitation. Yeah, so I guess I'm just going to contextualize my work a bit, because as Liliana was saying, my work isn't here on view, so I'll kind of give you a little backdrop, a little kind of sense of where I'm coming from for this conversation, so I'm not just parachuted in. But in some ways, you can say that a lot of my focus is on modes of listening, ways of listening, especially non-normative ones. Very interested in making work or exploring work, whether in writing, recording, or in sound pieces, in kind of finding ways to move away from the ear in terms of listening. That can be fiction, for example, metaphors, use of this, the way that sound is spoken of, the way within literature sound is written. With this Infinite Ear project that Liliana was speaking of, this was a project that was kind of made with the Curators Council, which was it's a curatorial group that's now stopped. They just ended their activities, but they were based in Paris. And basically they invited many artists to work under the premise that deafness is an expertise on sound. So within that project, for example, the visual and haptic listening became very, very important because we couldn't, let's say, rely on the cochlea or rely on the ears as the kind of modus of listening, or the way to take in sound and air pressures. But for that project, me and two other artists, two other friends, Valentina Desideri and Miriam Lefkowitz, our part of that project was working with local communities, deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing people all across the spectrum. Because one of the premises is that deafness is the spectrum, that we all hear differently, and it's very important for me politically to kind of reinforce the idea that, you know, we're all situated in a different spot, so we're all going to hear this even a bit differently than everyone else. You know, of course, there's invariances and there's generalities, and we know how to deal with those things. You're not hearing my voice if I do that because the perspective is shifting of the microphone. Little details like that become very important for this type of project, where for 2 weeks, me and these two friends were sharing practices with local communities of something called sound massage, which was developed by someone named Terry Madiot, for example, where, just to give you an image of what it's like, picture yourself lying on a wooden table where you have earplugs, and on top of the earplugs you have those big ear defenders as well. And then you close your eyes, and underneath you lying down, people are playing pieces of metal, wood, rubber, plastic over this plane of wood. So everything you're hearing is coming from your flesh, from your bone, and it's much abstracted from, let's say, the usual way that you would hear something. And if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you're also going to be hearing something through this experience. So this kind of sound massage that was developed by Terry Madiot very much involves that type of listening. And I was actually saying this to Lawrence the other day, that there a lot of conversations surged out of that type of practice where people of the deaf community might question the use of the word listening, you know, and say like, no, I've never listened before. I don't have any relationship to listening or to the audible realm, and I don't want to. Why do you call it listening? And this, you know, obviously ends up in a conversation, and kind of it problematizes the idea. But this kind of project is open to that. You know, we're working directly with local deaf communities and hard of hearing communities in order to have these conversations and try and expand out, explore what listening could be. Yeah, and this took place in Moscow, it took place in Madrid, in Bergen, in Sharjah. I wasn't there. The initial project was in Sharjah, which I was not part of, but it came about because the project Infinite Ear was invited to take place inside a school for deaf children. And as an example of one of the things that came out of that was these children were given field recorders and these thing called sub-packs, which is these little backpacks that vibrate. And basically the field recorders were plugged into the backpacks that could translate the sound into vibrations. And the kids were invited to go around the city and record sounds that they were experiencing, and there's a moment that was told to us when we were invited to the project, which I think is really beautiful, and again gives into this space of how sound is formulated, how listening is framed, how listening is contextualized, where many of these children had heard that at crosswalks there's a sound. So there was a moment that happened where the kids were going to the crosswalk and searching for the sound so that they could feel the sound of the intersection of the crosswalk, because they were told that there's a sound at the crosswalk when the light changes. And this kind of sonic investigation, whether deaf, hard of hearing, or hearing, is very, very important to me, especially politically, as a way of just kind of disinvesting from the sense that listening only happens here. I mean, if you've ever been to a club, you know what it's like to feel bass, you know what it's like to have this register for you. And of course, there's many, it's not all chill, you know, of course, there's many ways that this can be manipulated, there's many ways that this can be articulated for dread, for threat, for, you know, there's a lot of violence that can be created as well. It's not all great. One other thing I guess I wanted to go into just before was there's a paper that I wrote called Nuclear Sonic, which kind of deals more directly with the topic at hand of conflict soundscapes. The paper was called Nuclear Sonic, and in that paper, which you can read, it's online, it's open source. In that paper, I developed this idea of nuclear sonic, where at the beginning there's an analysis of there's these two sound artworks that are very well known that take place in Chernobyl. One of which is by Jacob Kierkegaard, where he performs a kind of Alvin Lucier style I am sitting in a room type piece, where he puts a microphone into an empty room, into a demolished, destroyed room in Chernobyl, and records the room tone, records the feedback that's created from recording the room and playing back the room into the microphone and playing back the room into the microphone countless times, so what you're hearing is the room. But the framing of that piece is very much that Chernobyl is a desolate place, there's nothing there, there's no nature, there's no people. At the same time, several years later, a different artist named Peter Cusack made a project called Sound from Dangerous Places, and his work is a lot more, I mean, he uses the term sonic journalism or sound journalism, and what he did is he went to Chernobyl and recorded folk song, recorded field recording, because there are people there, there are animals there, there's a lot of stuff going on there. So his premise was, let's frame this space, this very contested space, in a very different way, and kind of show the fact that there are people there, and record their stories, record their songs, and this kind of thing, and let's gain more awareness of what's actually happening there. So those are very different projects, and in the paper I sort of counterpose those two aesthetic framings, you can say, of that space. I don't know if I should go into anything else, or I can just leave it at that, and then we have more space for conversation. Yeah, for now.
So thank you for giving a little bit more of your work. Just to say that this conversation is to happen also with you, so we'll start here, but please feel free at a certain moment, even if you feel that before I open the stage, if you want to intervene, just say, because the idea is really to create a conversation, mostly if you already saw also the pieces that are presented in Teatro Circo, and also other things that can pop up, please just say, and we'll create this circle of conversation. You said that it is nuclear sonic paper that you wrote, somehow it's more related to this topic today, but at the same time with what you spoke about this project that you did about deafness and other ways of approaching the listening, it also, for me, it also resonates a lot with what I experienced yesterday with Lauren's performance, because it's a lot also about how what's happening in your bodies and in our other senses when we are exposed to this constant sound of military aircraft. I was thinking, and in fact before we shared a little bit about this, but when I was seeing your performance yesterday, and also reading your paper on nuclear sonic, I was thinking, it made me think about an historian that works with the history of these big fires, these big catastrophes that happens, and we had one some years ago here in Portugal. And normally we see these big things happening that we can recognize that they are quite violent, and we have several situations of war now. And if we go to the context that you mentioned, and the Israeli context and Gaza, we have this modern catastrophe happening. But there is something that sometimes we don't see, that it's the slow disaster, things that prepare for the big thing, and that are ongoing and ongoing. And I think that you addressed this a little bit, and you also are working with this, with daily conditions of like big violences also. So I don't know if you want to address this a little bit. Also, what do you think about it, and how does it express in your work?
So you mean how to think about the protracted nature of violent events through sound, or?
Yes, that also, but also how do you, yesterday you were really speaking about this daily. It was daily life.
Yeah.
It was not like there is this sentence in your piece that I know that it was not only me that was attracted somehow by this sentence, but this idea that you don't listen the bomb that kills you, but only if I'm not quoting very well, but there is this idea that you never listen to the bomb that kills you, but only if it kills you slowly. So it's also this quotidian violence. So I think that you are bringing evidence in your works somehow. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was attracted to produce the research behind air pressure because people had become so used to living with Israeli military vehicles in the sky above them in Lebanon that they ignored them. And to the most part, they'd become kind of ignorable. And at moments of peak anxiety, like the explosion in Beirut port, they immediately returned as a kind of answer. So you understood then that although ignorable, although so frequent that they're part of your life, at moments of peak anxiety, they they move from the background to the foreground. And it was this interplay between background and foreground, the weaponization of the background, of the ambient space, that I found most interesting, or most sort of, what would I want to say, that I found needed the most kind of exploration. Because the minute I released the numbers, and I produced the first set of numbers on this issue that is now referenced all the time in the UN. No one had done the work to aggregate these numbers. When I released the numbers, it became an event again. It became exceptional. They say, wow, look, 22,000 planes in 15 years. And I actually missed the whole kind of registration of the violence, which is that it's every day, right? And the minute you turn something into an event, right, you lose a specificity about what it is as a kind of protracted experience. And that's also why I think things like occupation interpolate artists and aesthetic practitioners, because there is no one video, no one event that can capture an occupation. It actually demands a kind of aesthetic strategy to make it visible or make it audible. And therefore, there's an interpolation to people like us, designers, artists, architects, whoever you might be, to actually intervene and produce the kind of images that are necessary to manifest things like occupation or apartheid or whatever else it might be, gendered violence, right? I think, and you know, what was always so fascinating is that, so I went to make the research because of that kind of ambient warfare. But at the same time, when I started observing the artifacts of all the documentation of those planes in the sky, you see in parallel two modes of resistance happening at the same time. One is somebody actively documenting the plane, trying to find where the rumbling is coming from, right? Mostly futile, right? There's only very few moments where you actually see the plane. I don't know if you saw yesterday. Those are all videos where there is planes in the sky. Mostly you just...
A ghost almost.
Mostly you just see the rumbling, or you feel the rumbling. So there's somebody actively looking to try and document the violation as a kind of violation of their rights, of their, you know... And then in the background, you hear laughing, talking, people having beer. And it struck me that these are two modes of resistance that are happening at the same time. One is a kind of active resistance that is trying to look for it. And the other, just as active, in fact, but is actively ignoring this thing. Right? And that the work needed to kind of find that space where you could try to understand both those sort of headspaces, if you want, and what they both mean. So not only that it is an oppression, there's two kinds of witnesses that this is producing also. A witness that ignore actively and a witness that seek actively.
Yeah. Ignore in order to be...
Yeah.
It's a kind of daily life resistance to persist also in daily life.
I think also this, I mean, the activeness of it is also important here in some ways, like this moving something from the background to the foreground. It's a much more individualized instance, but this sound massage table I was speaking of, kind of whether the person was deaf or hearing or hard of hearing, very much so after the experience, people were going, oh yeah, I feel this all the time. I'm just not aware of it. There was even I did one sound massage to this couple, one of which, they were both deaf. One had been deaf since birth, and the other had became deaf throughout her life. And they were about 60 years old or so. And the man who was deaf his whole life, after the experience, he just said, why don't I experience this when I'm in bed at night? You know, it was just like, he was kind of relating it to his past experiences, and in some ways I think it is analogous in the sense of it's something that's there all the time. These vibrations are there all the time. It's just that we're kind of framed, or we're not told to, we're just habitually, you know, experiencing just a portion or just focusing on a little part. So I think kind of it's really great that you've made this kind of aggregate of data in order for this to be way more present.
Right.
Whether or not that presence is to be ignored or to be actively resisted in some ways, you know, at least like it's been made aware, and then people can do what they want to or what they need to in relation to that thing. I think that's kind of one of the parallels in terms of the way that you articulate these sonic spaces.
Yes. How do you kind of resist this ambient violence, but also not lose what makes it violent, which is its ambience in a way? And it's similar, you know, and what you were saying also, I mean, I think, feeling these vibrations, feeling these kinds of, projections of exclusion, a way that deafness work, the way it reorients kind of the sonic experience. All those things I think are key when you are arguing for, let's say, when you, what's great about, I mean, okay, this is what I want to say. There is always this question, right, that come to me, and probably to you too. They say, "Oh wow, I didn't think about that from the perspective of sound," because usually we're such a visual culture, right?
Yeah, sure.
We're so ocular centric that we never think about sound. And I actually think it's the opposite.
Yeah,
it's kind of like back to this sound massage. We're so cochlear centric, right? That we have adapted amazing speed at which we can filter out what's important and what's not important. And we're better, much better than our visual sense at like totally blocking off what we don't and don't want to hear and don't want to listen to. So the kind of capacity and the sort of broad spectrum of frequencies of which we're exposed to, both kind of in ear and in body and whatever. It's always there, but we're actually acutely kind of filtering that all the time, and I think
we shorten the spectrum somehow.
Yeah, we're just very good at doing what we need to do with our hearing.
Your work is to open the spectrum.
Yeah, to return it. Yeah, it's
aware.
a kind of cochlear ignorance. It's to go back to to show people what happened before the sort of the precognitive stage of all that work that we do. In these milliseconds,
and perhaps I'll ask you from this about the work rubber-coated steel, because I think you are producing evidence with this, going back to this experience of sound. That so you have all this rubber-coated steel. If you didn't saw it, it's a piece that it's in the Salon Obra of Teatro Circo, and it's all this research also about how to show evidence that there was a murder and that it was shot by a specific gun from an Israeli soldier, and the argument is that of the defense. It's that now the military had only the possibility of shooting a rubber ball, but in fact all your work is also to show that now this sound proves that, and it's very delicate way that you do it, because it comes from testimony first, and from this capability that we have of listening and of making distinctions of things that happen very fast, but then you create. I don't know if you want to, because I think it's part also of, in order to do this research, this forensic research, you need also to do this kind of aesthetic research on senses.
No, I mean, sometimes it's like, to call it forensic is even like ridiculous, because, for example, on the point you mentioned, so the defense was they cannot possibly have been firing rubber bullets because the extension is for rubber guns, and that doesn't allow for the firing of live ammunition. Of course, you can find on the internet the manual for this extension. On the second page, it says, "Don't worry, you can also fire live ammunition through this." I mean, when you're dealing with kind of, especially military kind of logic, the force of argumentation, you're in another paradigm of kind of argumentation, right? It's like that saying, we don't know who said it, but military music is to music what military justice is to justice, right? So like stupefied, it's like this kind of thing, right? So this is often what you're facing. So I just wanted to it's not that like, wow, he's so smart, he found the thing. It's like, no, it just says on page 2.
Yes. But then still you need to prove it.
Yes, prove it, you prove it, yeah. You prove it by reading up to page 2, and then you can stop. But
well, and using a spectrogram.
Yeah. But more than that, of course, I think what you're pointing to, something broader in that work, is a kind of dissatisfaction that I had with the discourse on sonic warfare. And there was a lot of literature when I was making that work about LRAD cannons and things that fire sound, and these kind of things, and mosquito devices that pump. I started thinking, is that a sonic weapon, or is that just a gun that fires sound instead of bullets, instead of water, instead of, right? It's all kind of cannons, right? What defined the cannon is a whole series of things, not actually the medium of what's coming out of the end. And it occurred to me, and I started thinking, well, what is a sonic weapon? And maybe the most acute kind of sonic weapon is a courtroom. You know, with all of its capacities to allow this voice, to stop this here, to pull this out, to take long breaks, to see what resonate, what not. So it's a very sophisticated sonic weapon. And it is continuous with what, and specifically in speech, it can be weaponized. You know, it's continuous with the medium. It's not just firing sound, it's thinking sonically as a weapon. As, to some extent are those planes, broadcasting sound. And so I think the work is also about that. It's about trying to articulate what kind of you have this warfare that happen, and you have it taking place through sound, and through understanding it through sound and reading it through the space of the courtroom, you understand how there's a continual weaponization of sound that leaks well beyond the sound of one shot over another, kind of thing. Yeah.
Perhaps I would like also, following the answer of Lawrence's answer, I would like to go back to your work on nuclear sonic, and also about this continuity, that it's not only, so perhaps in the beginning I spoke about slow disasters that are prepared in the past and then they happen as an event of a big disaster. But I think that in your work you also address this continuation, and how somehow you also need to create these strategies, I don't know if it's the good word, to make visible this continuation that doesn't.
Yeah, sure. I didn't mention this, but the kind of latter part of this paper it uses the term nuclear sonic to talk about like extreme long duration, extreme long form sound pieces. Two examples of which are Jem Finer's Long Player, which is this 2,000-year, supposed to last for 2,000 years, piece that started, the first second of January 1st, the year 2000. And there's all these strategies of that Jem Finer has invented to, if the technology fails, how can you know exactly where you are in the piece in order to continue it, and this kind of thing. And there's another kind of quite famous example of this John Cage piece named As Slow as Possible, which there's a church in Germany that's kind of every couple of months changing some of the keys in order for the chord progression to continue. And I think that's supposed to last about 600 years or something like this, like way longer than an average human life. And like the thing for me with those pieces is that it's quite extreme to create a piece and expect a social structure to come around that is supposed to maintain and sustain your piece. Like you need to have a pretty, I don't mean any ill to Jem Finer, but it's like you need a pretty huge ego to want yourself or your piece to stay there for 2,000 years. And like to enlist people to continue your piece for 2,000 years, and like same for John Cage. Although there are stories that John Cage kind of made it as a joke, and now there's people taking it up because, of course, there's this status of the superstar and stuff like that, and people that want to continue John Cage's legacy. And I think in an ideal situation, it's kind of interesting to think of such long forms. So in general, in terms of temporality, the reason why I call it nuclear sonic is there's a lot of thought put behind what are we going to do with nuclear waste. You know, we're talking 10,000 year half-lives, and we're basically, it's just these long form durations that force us to kind of question what does language mean across time spans of 10,000, 2,000 years, and that poses a lot of questions, you know, about how does communication happen over these time frames and this kind of thing. And I think with acts of just random acts of slowness, whether violent or not, reconfigure what it means to pay attention, I think, you know, and for you know, for good and bad, like it, you know, or you know, it's for me this style of changing your attention, like if we just create some random, let's say, frequency shift that goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz over the span of your lifetime, it's going to be pretty hard for you to notice that frequency is shifting. You know, just inherently, it's going to be hard to notice that. Even if you do that over the span of just 10 minutes, it's very hard to notice that difference. So I think that there's this kind of there's this kind of way of aestheticizing an experience where when you inject long duration formats, forces a complete reshifting of what it means to pay attention, what it means to create, what it means to do. Of course, in that paper, I'm actually very harsh to the creators of these pieces. But at the same time, I think that it poses a lot of questions which are very interesting. You know, like bracketing all the harshness, it is a quite interesting question of what is it, how do you do, because a lot of the times what you're doing when you're doing a piece like this, I think, is you're kind of forcing the threshold of audibility to be just below noticeable difference. And kind of a lot of what I'm interested in and what I see in your work as well is kind of trying to move that threshold of just noticeable difference so that it is noticeable, so that you can articulate around it, whether or not it becomes audible, but at least we can describe it so that we can point to it, we can talk about it, we can talk around it, we can use it as evidence, we can go to it. So
Yes.
yeah, for me it's very entrenched. But I wanted to pick something up with your piece of the rubber bullets, like in relation to your later work, where, because this, if I understand correctly, this trial never happened. It's almost not possible for it to happen, right? Because it's not admissible as evidence. But maybe today it might be. Like maybe when you made the work, I don't know if it would have been.
No,
It's
it
an
wasn't a
open
problem
question.
of the evidence, it was a problem of the conditions of witnessing what there would be, and knowing that a trial would never happen for such a soldier. So then I decided to write what it would be like myself, and then in the writing of the trial realized who would never speak at that trial.
Right.
And then realizing how, and you know, all the things I spoke about before. So yeah, you know, what a rubber bullet adapter does to a live ammunition is it's kind of work like a bit like a silencer, so it can suppress the sound. And that idea of sort of sonic suppression is what carries the work through. It's also why it's shot in a shooting range, which is a place where like the sound of guns can be contained, quite literally. So it's, you know, all of that's there, and then that extends, of course, to the voices. And the piece ends with, you know, and it's also a way to question the position of the expert in this situation. Coming back to visuality, it was, you know, the expert in that case to examine the difference between a rubber bullet and a live ammunition has to look at the visualization of sound to do that. Whereas the people who are being fired at show signs that actually they can tell immediately what's what by their response. And so those people who are being fired at would never be considered the experts. And they're never invited in a similar way in which your project was also sort of reorienting the position of the expert around deaf experience. But yeah.
And I have more questions, of course, and we can keep the conversation here, but perhaps I will start by inviting already the audience, if you want to start to add also to this conversation, please just tell us questions or comments or things that you'd like to share, perhaps of the experience that you are already have of the piece. If there's still not, I have one question, perhaps starting from your performance yesterday. But I think I will extend the subject for both of you. That is, we are speaking about also created evidences and showing that, and you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation that when people listening about the numbers of the airplanes that appeared, they were like, oh, so much, and so. And sometimes when we are trying to show something, there are lots also of works and even artworks who are working with data. Sometimes they can deliver it in a quite conceptual way and some cold way. It's also a way of doing. But in your piece, in your performance, I really feel that there is this emotional and personal implication when you speak about your situation, your situatedness of your experience. You speak about the anniversary of your PhD director, I think. You speak about your daughter was being born, so there is a lot of things that have to do really not only with this cold data, with numbers and with analyzing the effects of the body, but really this more affective dimension. So I'd like to know if you can tell us a little bit more about this, because it's...
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, of course, when I'm reading some of those numbers and I'm giving them off, the noise overtakes me and you don't even hear anymore. But when you're talking about 1,609 hours and 82 minutes of flight time, the numbers stop being useful and start being noise. You stop being able to understand past a certain threshold, like, 800 planes coming in, and that's the point, that it's, in a way, there's also a threshold, there's different kinds of, I think I like to work across different kinds of discursive spaces and trying to define where the limits of one necessitate the space for the other. So yes, we produce all this data, but at a certain point that data also becomes noise. It demands another kind of registration for hearing it and listening to it. But yet the data is itself necessary. So it's these kind of, what numbers are given to journalists versus how do you reflect on that personally and think about that through the sort of a situated experience. And how does that, change the conditions of listening to the story. But I wanted to also make the case that if we understand this as a performance, these 15 years of airplanes in the sky, and when I aggregate the numbers, you see that the total flight time of the 15 years is 8.5 years long. So it's getting to at least a third of the Gem Finer piece. And I think there's an argument to say this is also a durational, kind of like extreme durational sound experience, sonic experience that's being produced. And one that also has these kind of callbacks, these persistent reference. So, for example, who was there in 2006 when the planes actually came and bombed Lebanon? Remember those plane sounds differently than the generation who was born after 2006 or who were too young to remember 2006. Again, sometimes speaking to people who were, who have experienced there's multiple wars before 2006. 2006 is in my generation, So the way that those sounds called to the memories of people actually are different depending on what you associate that sound to. And that's the thing with this study into the noise pollution, that what he says is that once you've heard the sound very loud, whenever you hear it quietly, you have the same physiological effects. So wherever it's recalling back to that first kind of intense experience, the rapid onset of such a noise, you know, it's kind of, people are tethered to it from different generational perspectives also. And then in that way it also has a duration. So yeah.
You can almost lose the first reference and the first event that
Right.
produces the sound, but you have this effect that it's going.
And if you never understood, if you only understood in the abstract what those vehicles are capable of, then it can also become farcical. There's also a way in which 22,000 jets is farcical. It was like a bit of a, you know, the first one, okay, it's scary. Second one, okay, you know. Then after time, it's like, okay. And you see, we aggregate on the website all the tweets around this thing, and you see a whole range of emotions. A lot of jokes, people making jokes. Ah, they're back again. They're coming. Today they're flying solo. They're going to get stuck in my washing line. This, that, you know, oh, I told the pilot, come sit with me, have tea. And
Yes.
but then you also have ones which are like pure fear, you know, Allah yastur, you know, what's going to happen to us. And then you also see some that are like more citizen journalists, you know, like this happened today and it happened
Facts.
over this thing. And so there's different kinds of ways it's constantly kind of interpolating people. And there was another that the tweets also give a different resolution to understand these kind of durational effects.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the emotional implications also.
Exactly,
Something
yeah.
that sometimes we don't are so close to.
Yeah.
No, sure. I mean, there's actually, we were talking about this a bit earlier, but it's, you know, it's how that plane is kind of thought about as friend or foe, or this kind of thing matters a lot as well. And I was saying earlier that, you know, my parents are from Terceira Island in the Azores, from Praia da Vitória. There's a military base right beside that city, and I remember as a child, just you hear these planes overhead shaking the building that you're in all the time, because those buildings are not made to withstand the sound of those planes that are just landing. So it doesn't have any connotation of being a violent sound, or even as noise pollution. I think that none of that sound in that area is being thought of as noise pollution.
Right.
You know, but it's, I mean, at least from my earliest memory, because I used to go there as a child once in a while in the summers or this kind of thing. So I could say at least for almost 4 decades, this sound has been present there. But it hasn't been present as something to think of as pollution, to think of as noise, to think of as within the frame of this dread, or within this kind of fear, which is kind of bizarre. I mean, of course, a lot of the people living there are working in the base in different ways and this kind of thing, so the relationship to these sounds are very different, but the experience of those sounds is still there. There will be this kind of form of memories, there will be this kind of way of tracking the modulation of this airspace, which is it's an airspace that has been granted for use. So there's no infractions taking place, which of course shifts the discussion completely. But at the same time, experientially and individually, it's very different. There's people of my family who could just hear the noise of the house shake and know what type of plane is flying overhead. Yeah. You know, just because of the kind of intensity of the shake and this kind of thing, which is like pretty extreme as an experience, to have this type of topology in your experience of this is this warship or this. It's a kind of really intensive thing that I think there also, because it's not treated as a type of infraction or anything like that, it's just kind of normalized in the same way that, I mean, you mentioned this is a bit me squirreling around, but you mentioned that at some point there are generators that have the same frequency as these planes, and there's a kind of ambivalent relation to the noise, because you're not sure if that's just a generator or if it's now a plane. And I imagine for the people that have this kind of stress response in relation to the flight, that the generators are also, like the sound of the generators aren't going to be great. You know, like it's going to be pretty intense.
No, I mean, when I published the website and the data, the Lebanese interior ministry reached out to me, and I took the call. And you know, first of all, they were trying to charm me. They say, you know, thank you for the work you did. And then they said, we want you to do this health studies that, because I published the health studies on the website, airpressure.info. But they said, we want you to do one of these health studies for Lebanon. I said, fine, but this is a stress response. So what do you think is going to give someone a heart attack first? The Israeli plane in the sky, or that they lost all their life savings to a government Ponzi scheme? And the guy's like, oh, okay.
Perhaps it's not a good idea.
Exactly. So, and to your point, exactly, it's about where these things are interfacing and masking each other and how they're actually, what was the point I was trying to make? Something.
No, I think you were just wanting to describe the.
This is. I mean, this is to your point. Yes, the airspace is given.
Yeah, exactly.
But the acoustic space is not.
No, not at all.
And this is always the kind of fallacy between kind of property law, if you want to kind of reduce sovereignty into such a thing, right? Between kind of like property and noise, the way noise works, the way sound propagates, right? It's just they're always in this kind of conflict space. We're working now on this thing with wind farms, looking at the noise of wind farms. You see that the land upon which the turbine has been sold and bought, but of course the propagation of the sound around that is so much more extensive. And so there's always this tension between, I think, what define a kind of legal political space and how noise is actually always expands that. And I always quote my friend Muhammad Safa, who says that from the perspective of noise, all war is disproportionate. From the perspective of noise, all war is disproportionate. Yeah, and I think it's the same. Yeah.
It's always too much.
It's always there's always more.
Excess.
There's always in excess of whoever is the target, right? And you know, used then to argue why all war is disproportionate, of which there are as many reasons to argue that. But yeah.
Perhaps I will ask again if there is any question or comment. Yes, two. Heard one there.
Thank you. Oh, is it on? Yeah. I guess I'm thinking about the filtering of noise as a mode of survival then, which also kind of links to yesterday's presentation with Tatiana and Joanna. So Joanna researching data, tracking on the internet and what that does to people. And her kind of mode of practice then was to reenact this with students with their bodies. So each person would be like a cookie or a data center or whatever. And this caused kind of strong emotional reactions in the students to the point where like one of them had a panic attack. And then if the practice is kind of to, I mean, these things are already in the body, but to kind of remind people that these things are constantly happening to us as we use the internet or live in a city with a sky above it. And kind of where that goes then. So it's like presenting that presenting that to us, but where that can lead. I mean, you said that the kind of Lebanese interior ministry contacted you, or that the UN then might take those figures. But yeah, what avenues are possible beyond the kind of presentation as an artwork?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it's to produce kind of a cognizance for or the Lebanese people, or not Lebanese people, residents of Lebanon, because there's a vast. These things played such a presence in people's lives, but they knew almost nothing about what they were doing, where they were going, and it's also to disaggregate these from a kind of individuated experience, where, for example, I'm boiling a kettle. And I don't hear the plane above me, but Lendl's downstairs, and suddenly he's, or something, right? He suddenly hears the plane. Do you hear that? No, I didn't, right? They're very brief passing moments, and they're very kind of individually experienced somehow. So aggregating the data, I mean that you actually sort of cross-corroborate that across the population in a way, right? You verify people's experience on the ground as a kind of shared experience, and disaggregate it from this individual experience. And also then you're able to, so on the website, you see every trajectory that those planes had. You see the time in, the time out, not just how long, not just aggregated in terms of just how much each day or month. And in doing that, learned some sort of, built some kind of understanding of what this strategy was, right? First of all, a lot of people thought that those planes, and you see this in the tweets, that in the discourse online, a lot of people think that those planes are going to Syria and striking targets in Syria, and that Lebanon is just a through route. In fact, there is only 2 instances in the entire database where those planes went from Lebanon to Syria. Okay? So suddenly we understand actually this is only just about flying around Lebanon, right? So in a way you take away what was the kind of reason for this thing, and you actually have to start asking other questions. Well, what is the reason? Why is it just flying around Lebanon? It is a huge mass surveillance exercise. It's maybe one of the biggest, in fact. I mean, 22,000 planes in such a short time. Certainly the biggest of one sovereign nation to another, in terms of what all those planes are harvesting. Phone calls, data, photographs, right, everything. But it also start to eat at the Israeli military reason for doing that, which is surveillance. Because you don't need 22,000 planes to do surveillance. That's way in excess of what you need, right? I mean, you have satellites. You're already able to ping the phone calls from however, right? I mean, it's totally excessive. It's not necessary. So it slowly understand that they increase again in the summer, right? That we always found that in the summer was the most intense activity. And that's the worst time for aerial photography. So it started to kind of break a set of narratives and a set of rhetorics that were being presented as the necessity for this activity, and reframe it and understanding, building a kind of knowledge around this to understand that it was actually about something else. And the majority of what it was about was using Lebanese airspace as a kind of laboratory for weapons and testing the flights, and for intimidation, just collective punishment, punitive. And we know, of course, now, when I published that work, that was a kind of potentially radical statement. Now we understand very well that collective punishment is just a kind of, is almost accepted now by the West as a necessary act in the genocide in Gaza. So so in that sense, you can measure the kind of efficacy of a piece of research by the kinds of authorities that read it, but really first and foremost it was about producing a kind of cognizance on the ground and disseminating as much information about that as possible. And now, whenever it just happened about 3 weeks ago, a Lebanese government person wanted to say about how this has been going on for ages. And he started and used my numbers. And I know he used my numbers because he read the exact way it's formulated on the website. He didn't even go deep, right? So he said, and this is 8.5 years of flight time. This is exactly what we say, right? So, but then completely uncredited, which is great. It sounds like they did all the work, which is fine, but I'm underseeing various instances, which was my point, where it is productive of context, right? And I think that was the most important thing, because I thought when the next time this war sort of leaves its atmospheric and ambient condition and enters something much more destructive, which it is now in the south of Lebanon, you would need the context to understand that this has been happening all the time. So that it's not just how the news say it, like, Hezbollah fired this rocket, so they came back, right? That it's a call and response. Actually, they were there, in 2020, I think there's more than 2,000 instances. There's 0 missiles that flew from Hezbollah. So you have to, so when I see it being productive of context, and those things are very hard to sort of point to its usefulness. But when I see that guy, this Lebanese politician, using my numbers to say, okay, and so it is entering the psyche somehow, and it's becoming a condition that now has a kind of set of values that can be spoken to, and etc. Yeah, and I mean what I say in the talk, that they actively do not want you to understand this what's going on as well. They actively want to produce this kind of unverifiability of this same incident.
Kind of counter noise.
Yeah. So it was against all the kind of agents and actors in that thing, it was against the UN, who were in fact, unsystematically categorizing this thing completely. It was in these letters that were spread all over the digital library, these letters that were addressed from 2 UN bodies, completely, so uncategorized, undigitized, everything. It was against Hezbollah for the claim that they are the resistance, when in fact we showed us 22,000 times they could have been the resistance. Instead, they chose to sell Captagon. And it's against, of course, the Israeli Air Force for their continual acts of collective punishment and violations of lives, and yeah.
There is another, it's Humarian, another question.
Okay. Thank you. It's really great to hear you both talk. Maybe the thing I was thinking about, I had this image in my head that is a little bit futile, but maybe just to put this in the scenario is sometimes I'm talking with my father and we wonder about what the weather, is it going to rain or not? And we're just having this conversation, and he looks at the sky and I look at my phone. Basically, he trusts his own interpretation of the events, and I just trust somebody else's interpretation that's on my phone. And yesterday, when I was watching your performance, Lawrence, at the theater, I was wondering what it's like. I was thinking, probably in this room, nobody's been in a country at war. No, nobody in this room has lived this. And then thinking also that politically, probably everybody in this room is kind of sided with the perspective and the evidence shown in your work. And then at some point I thought, but perhaps I was becoming more conscious that you were not presenting us with evidence so much. Perhaps you were presenting us with a lot of moments of doubt. And we talked about this a little bit, but there was a lot of moments where you were inviting us to doubt something. And I was wondering if that's a conscious decision in a way, if, in terms of what your work does also at the end of the narrative, let's say, the show, there's a shift in perspective, right? You've been always watched from below, and you decide to go on this ride and watch from above. And so I was wondering also if you're playing with us as viewers, as witnesses, and if you're inviting us also to witness our everyday and be more attuned and be more, if that's a conscious decision.
Yeah, all those decisions were very conscious. But it, you know, in many ways, that's what's the space of the performance offers. These moments of self-reflection and doubt, and which, you know, you are not afforded in this, you know, in times where you're presenting this as evidence. And this again coming back to that thing where the data itself becomes noise. So it's not only what we imagine research to be and how it manifests that it can be useful, but also in all these other ways. And those are conscious decisions. And like you say, you identified there's a shift in perspective, where you're then producing the noise in a way, as well as being subject to it.
I was thinking about this question of doubt that Mariana just brought to the conversation. And perhaps I would like to ask you if this is not also part of this oral culture, that it's a kind of tool that because when we see, we add this culture of visual culture, when we can clearly see objects and we can almost develop a kind of certitude that it's developed through the importance that we give to the sense of visuality. But both of you work a lot with this sense of listening, of more oral experience. And I was thinking if doubt cannot be also a way of opening this field of experience. I don't know if you can say a little bit more.
Sure. Well, yeah, I don't know if I would personally put one form of experience against another, but I think oral ambiguity is a very specific type of ambiguity, and like I'm lucky because my specific accent allows me to say oral, and you don't know if I mean listening or speaking, but so oral with an O or oral with an AU.
Oral.
Yeah, you would say it differently. But I mean, but this kind of pivot point of sense or making sense of is something that I think is very important cross-modally and multi-sensorially. You know, there's various times where we see something and we think that it's something else, or we hear something and we think that it's something else. And this kind of, and it, I mean, I've said this, I feel like I'm saying this over and over and over again during this thing, but I think that this can be used actively as well. It's possible to create a sonic experience or just an experience in which the person experiencing this thing, or even just not even person, but let's say under modes of surveillance, there's ways of tricking surveillance by thinking or by masking the perception.
By relating with it in a different way.
Yeah, exactly, and also by like some type of camouflage, right? There are various ways of mobilizing and operationalizing ambiguity such that it functions as camouflage, or it functions as a way of hiding or being counter surveillance or this kind of thing. A lot of these experiences, or just the way that sensation and the way we make sense of sensation work, allows for this. It's, you know, I don't think anything is ever so clear cut, but we try, right? I think that corroboration and evidence is, you know, or making evidence is this kind of attempt to try and make something more intelligible with a certain bias, right? You're trying to say this rather than this. And you're not trying to do that without corroboration. You know, you're not trying to, but you are trying to force it in some way. You're showing this rather than this, or you're focusing on that rather than that. And for me, I think just experience and sensation in general has that kind of plasticity and that kind of fluidness, where it's very difficult to have it super crystal clear, or have it, you know, whether in audio or in visual or in haptics or this kind of thing. And I think this is why I said so much around like, well, fictioning or framing or contextualizing. I think that doing those things around a sensation or around some kind of sensitivity allows for a type of focusing, allows for a type
of action.
Exactly, and a type of kind of modulation of what attention can mean as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I run this organization called Earshot, which does sound research for human rights and open source intelligence. And we produce kind of videos often which try to demonstrate the way we came to a certain conclusion. And to Lendl's point, usually we're speaking from a position of relationality. We're establishing, it's never this indexical thing, right, that people would expect from a video. You know, satellite image turned to 3D model. We all understand that visually, right? Actually, to do that sonically, you need to first understand certain kinds of acoustic phenomenon. So first you're explaining them, then so we're kind of really struggling not with the research, but actually with the ways in which we kind of mediate the research in a way that everybody can understand. Because historically, sound expertise has only ever been somebody resting on their credentials and giving evidence as an opinion that rest on certain kind of experience. They don't actually invite the viewer or the person in to understand how these things emerged and how they came to be and why that means something. And often what we're doing, for example, it's never like, oh, that echo means that this person was there. It's like that the echo is moving in this way across 13 shots, in this, that we see this trend of the way the echo is, so it's never one thing. Everything is contingent on the other thing. And it's actually like, it produces a very difficult kind of storyboard. Yeah. And we're still struggling with how do you kind of create those storyboards of one to the other. Yeah.
You are not dealing only with cause and that effect, but you are dealing really with the relationships.
Yes, exactly.
That make an effect.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's the perception that it makes sound a kind of weaker form of evidence rather than actually the means by which evidence existing and the kind of logics of evidence not actually having space for sound as such and the way that sound behaves.
I found this question of ambiguity very interesting, that we could move on and on with this, but perhaps I will ask again if there is any comment, question. There is one.
Hi. I'm going to ask you not for a state-of-the-art kind of response, but how is the general panorama in terms of research about sound as oppression? As we've seen some of the nice examples you show us, well, not nice, but you showed us here, but can you give us what's the talk of the town? I mean, about sound as oppression, because it seems to me like a very interesting topic.
The talk of the town, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's still understood, of course, as it's not really taken so seriously, where in actual fact the quantitative sort of argument is there, right? In the sense that, let's say, the most amount of, let's say, the most common injury of people, of soldiers, of US veterans is, of course, hearing loss, right? So it means actually the most common war injury is sonic, but that's again very physical, right? I mean that literally, like hearing capacity damage. And I think what we're talking about is something a little bit more of a higher resolution. But just to put that in context, And there was something else I wanted to say about that. The sound is, yeah. I think, yeah. I think, as you pointed out really well before, the capacity for sound to inhabit and change atmospheres and vibes, literally vibes. The tweets that we aggregate on the website, they're all tweeted under this hashtag called Harbi Ba'ajwa. Harbi Ba'ajwa means war in the vibes, or it's the same kind of war in the atmosphere, but also it's a double meaning as vibes and atmosphere is, atmosphere. I think we all understand the capacity for music to engulf and change and totally transform a kind of space that would otherwise need no visual change. But translating that to kind of oppressive and conflict and the way that's mobilized in those places is still quite rudimentary, I think. We're not really understanding that in terms of how sound can be so useful at and so pervasive, not in its capacity to damage hearing, but in its capacity to exist in the background, right? And just hang there.
To interact with our nervous system also now in this more subtle.
Not in the way that it stops you from living, in fact, in the way that you live with it.
Yes, yeah. Not my point was, but I think it's
We are recording, so if you can use with that.
if I yeah. It's usually credited to John Cage, but someone said that what is not normal is the absence of noise. And we live with so many layers of noise, being noise pollution, most of them, that I was research taking that into account when it comes to try to understand how are we as human beings tolerating more and more and more of these layers. I guess that was it. I'm sorry if I turned it somehow confusing.
No, I appreciate the question, really. I just wanted to say also that the question of noise abatement and kind of getting rid of noise or dealing with noise is actually quite old. There's an article, there's an essay by Schopenhauer where he references, so this is the mid-19th century, he references a pamphlet, I think it's based in Munich, about noise pollution, about the presence of whips and the sound of whips and the kind of desire to reduce the sound of whips in public places because, people are using whips on animals, they're using whips on people, and they're also using whips just to get attention. Because at the time they're kind of using whips to make sound to then, let's say, sell a newspaper or something like that. And it's actually beautiful paper. And there's a part, there's a kind of very poetic part where Schopenhauer is saying, I really want these whips to stop so that I could just write and think because they're everywhere. And it's kind of wild to read this because then, it's like over 100 years of this kind of thinking, and if you kind of keep tracing it, there's a letter by Seneca, so now we're talking like 100 or like 65 AD, or whatever kind of letters you want to attach to it, but year 65, and Seneca's complaining about the bathhouse that he lives in front of and about the sounds that are coming out of this bathhouse, and that there's this kind of uncontrollable noise of people, of just people kind of screaming, selling stuff, etc. And he describes all these noises in detail, and I mention that because if you trace where Schopenhauer is getting this information, you can trace it very clearly back to Seneca and this letter. But I think that, it would be nice, I guess, if there was some kind of historiography of contextualizing noise and noise abatement so that we can kind of like more clearly understand where these questions are coming from, and not just in this kind of Armory Schafer way of tuning the world and soundscape and let's kind of make the world a perfect place type of vibe. There's other ways of dealing, of tracking, of tracing these types of things. Like it's not to your question of what's the state of the art. I don't know. I imagine if there is one, it's probably quite subtle, you know, and under the radar in some ways, in a lot of cases. But it is a quite long, like this has been happening for quite a long time.
I think also to the point of, you know, a real point of convergence between myself and Lendl is not that we're using sound as any kind of medium. It's really that it's a conceptual tool for both of us, right? And I think listening, sound, the kind of ethics and politics of a given kind of active listening is a way through which we can read all kinds of things in the world. And I think a lot of what we do is spend a lot of time arguing. I mean, I don't know Lendl that well, but I can imagine from his research, we spend a lot of time arguing about why you shouldn't exceptionalize sound as well. As much as we talk about sound, we also argue for why it shouldn't be exceptional. And that's because there's a whole literature around sound which try to exceptionalize it, make it transhistorical, make it somehow an essential kind of characteristic of human experience, rather than actually something which is rooted in history and time and place, like the whip, right? But also, and to that point, I think, for me, the problem with noise abatement is exactly that it's kind of exceptionalized noise. And if you look at the history of noise pollution in law, it's all about actually aircraft. Aircraft kind of bring in noise pollution in law. And one of the very first cases of noise pollution is in the US Supreme Court, which is about a farmer whose chickens stopped laying eggs because of they were under the plane pass. So kind of an economic argument for, you know, he was losing money, his chickens stopped laying eggs. So again, it wasn't even a human listening. It was actually the chickens, on behalf of the chickens' ears, right, that we start the question of noise pollution. And so, but again, I think what I'm trying to do with air pressure is to make noise pollution air pollution again, right? To understand that it's also another way of the way it's connected to all the ways in which our air is being expropriated, right? That there is a theft of the air, of the quality, of its breathability, of the way that sound is traveling through it, of the way sound is occupying it, right? So I think there's much more in making those connections, right, between, let's say, chicken, man, air, right, than there is in sort of making sound its own kind of category of violence, of pollution, of et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
I think we are arriving to the end of our time. When we invited Lendl and Lawrence, we knew that they already met each other before, but as you could see, the conversation flows very well, and I think it also came from this previous knowledge of
yeah, we've crossed a couple times.
Yes. Perhaps I would just like to end. I don't know if you want to say something more to end the conversation. We spoke about a lot of things. Perhaps even more could came up, but we'll need to make a break because we'll have another conversation. I will just it's not summarized, of course, but it's just to take what you mentioned, that it's mostly, it's not about the sound that will not allow us to live, that will kill us, but it's really the sound that we need to live with. And so we are speaking about coexistence, that it's the motto of this Biennale. Yesterday we also spoke about the technologies that we need to live, this needy word, it's a little needs to be adopted also, but we spoke about that the awareness that we need to develop also of this coexistence with technologies. And in half an hour, we will speak about another type of coexistence, that is interspecies relationships, and we will focus on the work, Superflex work that it's in Mosteiro de Tibães. And the conversation will be with Björn Christensen, Ricardo Gomes, and moderated by the philosopher Inês Pereira Rodrigues. So I invite you to come here at 5:30 again. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.